Man, we have seen a crazy shakeup in the college football playoff top 25. And I've kind of had a feeling that this would be a little bit of a chaos weekend. The weekend before rivalry week, we get a little bit of look ahead spots in college football this whole time. And, we kind of took it for granted, like the chaos that I predicted a little bit. It wasn't any of the things that happened that really shook things up. Like I thought Ole Miss would struggle with Florida, but I figured they would get by Florida. And I certainly thought that Oklahoma would have been a little bit of a tricky game, maybe a game that's close at halftime, but I never thought that Oklahoma would win, let alone dominate the Crimson Tide. And the way that domination was put in place by the Oklahoma Sooners, it really needs to be shown that you cannot get dominated against an average football team the way that Alabama did. We'll see what Oklahoma does against LSU, but I really don't think they're beating LSU based on the fact that they just put their heart and soul into beating Alabama on senior day, and they're not going to be able to go to Death Valley and win that ball game. We will see, though, how this all plays out. I don't want to get ahead of myself because I do have many different thoughts of chaos that could potentially happen. And I really just don't want to get ahead of myself there. So without further ado, I'm going to give you the top 25 and explain it as thoroughly as I can here in this video. All right, I'm going to make this a little bit different here. We're going to take that out. Boom. This is my top 25. We're going to go down the ranking and we're going to talk about the current landscape of the college football playoff, despite the fact that there are different scenarios that could happen. I will touch on those, but won't get too crazy. I'll just explain why everybody is ranked where they are ranked. All right. We're going to start with Oregon and Ohio State. I think everybody can agree those are the two best teams in America. And though Texas at number 3 has no resume to be able to back themselves up, I frankly, even though, I'm kind of ignoring the struggle against Kentucky, I still think Texas is playing good enough football, and they're a very dangerous and talented team. I think their top-end talent is certainly there. Same with Penn State, by the way. I think they're able to compete with a lot of teams, and you guys can criticize them for, winning a close game against a 6-win Minnesota team. But when you see Alabama and Ole Miss lose to 6-win teams themselves this week, you kind of can't over criticize Penn State for surviving and advancing. And the way that I put Georgia here at 5 is pretty simple. Their strength of schedule is the toughest in America. They have wins over number 3 Texas, for example. And they also have a win against, they got 2 losses against number 15 Alabama and number 16 Ole Miss there. And they also have a dominant win out of conference against the number 13 team in the country, Clemson. When you take a look at Georgia's full body of work, yeah, they have a couple of losses under their resume. They lost to Alabama, they lost to Ole Miss, but they also have the wins to be able to show what their top-end ability is when they look as good as they did week 1 against Clemson, when they look pretty solid, pretty good. I think a lot of that had to do with Texas shooting themselves in the foot. But they still beat Texas, Georgia did, on the road. And I think that needs to be rewarded a little bit, especially when we talk about these flawed resumes, but still good resumes at 6, 7, 8, and 9. And honestly, I'm probably not giving SMU the respect they deserve. They lost to number 18 BYU early in the season, though, when Kevin Jennings had just gotten the start. They've been much better with Kevin Jennings ever since they've committed full time to him over Preston Stone. So really, you can make the argument that SMU should be ranked number 6. And depending on how this weekend's games go, I might just jump SMU up to number 6 based on how Miami does. But 6 through 9 to me is in a cluster. And the reason why it's ranked the way it is pretty simple. Miami has the talent in the offense that is going to be able to keep up with anybody in America. I truly believe that. I don't think that there is a secondary or a pass rush in America that's going to be able to completely stop the Miami Hurricanes. But I also think a lot of these top teams, like in Oregon, like in Ohio State, and even in Penn State, are going to be able to have success moving the football on the Miami Hurricanes. Certainly Texas too, Georgia as well. So I ranked Miami the highest because of the way I think that they're going to be able to keep it close in a lot of these games. I think just the outpitch that they have, to steal Joel Klatt's phrase from a year ago, talking about Marvin Harrison and Ohio State, they have Cam Ward in that passing attack. And I think that that's an outpitch that none of these other teams have. Indiana at 7. We could criticize who they have beaten, but at the end of the day, when they're beating a 6-5 Washington team, a 6-5 Michigan team, and you're seeing a lot of these other teams like a Tennessee lose, and more on Notre Dame in a second, but a Tennessee lose to those type of opponents, you can't be too critical of it. I mean, I'm sorry, you just can't. You got to give credit where credit's due with Indiana for winning those football games. Number 8, Notre Dame. The only reason I have them ranked below Indiana and Miami right now, they look better than both of them, but I cannot ignore the fact that they lost to Northern Illinois. It is taking a lot for me to even rank them above SMU and Tennessee right now, and even Boise State, the fact that they lost to Northern Illinois. But I'm doing it anyway because of how successful they have been as of late, and they'll be able to close out their season with what I think will be a rather impressive win against USC because of this. When you play one of those triple option teams, especially one as solid as Army has been all year, it is hard to come back the week later and be able to adjust and play well and win that game, certainly on the road against a USC team that I feel like is playing better football now than they were at times. And by the way, a USC team that's all 5 losses were by 1 score. We saw how Kansas, who have lost 5 of 6 games by 1 score, and that one loss that they had that wasn't by 1 score was closer than the score indicated. We see how they've been able to take down giants like Iowa State, BYU, and Colorado. Just because a team, and Florida's a good example of this too, just because a team has a bad record doesn't mean that they're not a good team right now. So we'll see what Notre Dame does this week. I will be very impressed if they just win, survive against USC. I think that will be worthy of a home field advantage game in the first round of the college football playoff for the Notre Dame Fighting Irish. SMU being ranked below them, honestly, there might be a little bit of brand bias there, but I just don't think that they have the top-end talent that these other 3 teams do. But I really am very close to being able to flip SMU from number 9 to number 6. You could order any of those 4 teams the way you want, but I believe Georgia should be above all of them just based on the strength of schedule that they've played and the wins that they've gotten in that strength of schedule. And then I think you can order any of those 4 teams where you want. Tennessee, they would be above all of those teams if they would have just beaten an average Arkansas team. That's what it comes down to for me with Tennessee, is they barely beat, or they barely lost, but they lost to Arkansas on the road. That's got to matter. That does matter to me, and that's why Tennessee is ranked 10th. I ranked them ahead of Boise State. The reason why is because Boise State has not looked great. They have not looked great lately. But the reason why Boise State should at least get a lot of respect and consideration is because their one blemish, their one loss on their resume is to the number 1 team on a walk-off field goal in which they allowed 2 special teams touchdowns. If it weren't for allowing those special teams touchdowns, Boise State would probably be the number 1 team in America. They truly would be. That sounds crazy, I know, but if they would have beat Oregon and Oregon would have gone on to have the same success that they have had, beating Ohio State, Oregon would at the very least, Boise State would at the very least be a top 3 team in America. Number 12, Arizona State. It's pretty simple. Ride the hot hand right now. They're beating teams right now. They're winning football games, and you got to reward that. I'm putting Arizona State up here above Clemson too, because I am not very impressed with Clemson still. I still think they have fraudulent tendencies, and I think that the Big 12 is more of a gauntlet than the ACC. And Clemson at number 13 and number 14, South Carolina, are about to play. Now, I know what you guys are going to say. Alabama and Ole Miss both beat South Carolina, but here's the deal with that. Against Ole Miss, South Carolina was playing their backup quarterback. They're a different team especially since that Alabama game with Lenora Sellers. Now, when it comes to the Alabama-South Carolina game, the reason why I'm ignoring that head-to-head is a couple of reasons. Number one, when you look at South Carolina's full body of work, they do not have the atrocious losses that Alabama and Ole Miss have. Both of them have lost to two average opponents. Kentucky at 4-7 for Ole Miss, and then Florida at 6-5 for Ole Miss. Alabama lost to 6-5 Vanderbilt and 6-5 Oklahoma. You can't ignore it. You can't ignore that. But the other reason why I'm ignoring the head-to-head with Alabama, I just explained it with Ole Miss. I get it was a blowout. I get it was a rout, but they had no offense going with the backup quarterback there. South Carolina lost by 2 on the road at Alabama with Lenora Sellers still banged up. And if you put that in a neutral site, that spread always favors home field by 2 or 3 points, making Alabama and South Carolina a pick 'em or South Carolina by 1. There's my justification for that. You don't have to love it. I just think South Carolina is mainly just playing better football. They've won 5 games in a row ever since that loss to Alabama on October 12th. I think that South Carolina is playing better football than those two teams. And if they beat Clemson this weekend, I think South Carolina should be in serious discussion over any other 3-loss team to be in the college football playoff. Alabama and Ole Miss needs to be punished for losing to bad competition. They cannot sneak into the playoff. We cannot set this precedent that in the first year of the 12-team playoff, I don't think the committee should be making a statement that you can lose to 2 barely bowl-eligible teams, or in Ole Miss's case, a non-bowl-eligible team, and still get into the playoff with 3 losses. You can forgive it once. You cannot forgive it twice. That's how I feel. That's why I feel like we should, for sure, be putting it in stone that Alabama and Ole Miss are eliminated from the college football playoff. You lost twice to teams that are about 500. That should not be forgiven. Shouldn't be forgiven. Alabama's ranked 13th, and pardon me on that TikTok play there. Alabama's ranked 13th in the AP poll. I understand why Alabama and Ole Miss are both ranked above South Carolina because they beat them, but you cannot ignore the factors that I had mentioned and the fact that South Carolina has been playing better football since that point. And the other loss South Carolina has is a classic against an LSU team that's just outside this top 25 that will probably reappear in every top 25 if they beat Oklahoma this weekend. Number 17, Iowa State. Number 18, BYU. The 2 did not play, so it does not matter as far as head-to-head goes. I put Iowa State above BYU by 1 spot because, again, by a narrow margin, they're playing better football as of late. The Big 12 will decide itself, though. I don't really think it matters where BYU, Iowa State, Arizona State, and Colorado are ranked because I do believe the winner of that conference is going to make the conference champion or the college football playoff. The only exception to that, I do believe that Tulane could potentially, crash the party there if Colorado finds a miracle and ends up winning it. But what I'm projecting to be the case is Arizona State's going to beat Arizona, BYU is going to beat Houston, and we're going to get an Arizona State-BYU rematch. I think that's how it's going to play out. If you look at the current Big 12 standings with the 4-way tie factored in there, including Colorado there, this is how it goes in the Big 12. Number 1 right now is Arizona State. Number 2 is BYU. Number 3 is Iowa State. And number 4 is Colorado. So that tells me if all 4 of these teams win the way that they're supposed to in rivalry week, we're going to get a rematch of Arizona State and BYU, and the winner is going to go to the college football playoff. I felt like Arizona State was the better team, but BYU was able to find a way to come back in that football game. Number 19, Texas A&M. I think Texas A&M is a very solid football team who let one get away against Auburn. They started off so bad against Auburn. They were looking ahead to Texas. But just like Alabama and Ole Miss, the margins are thin. And we really should, as a college football public, be treating Alabama, Ole Miss, and Texas A&M all similarly because they've all had similar results happen to them. The difference, I think, between Alabama and Ole Miss is in Texas A&M that you could argue in Texas A&M's favor is A&M did not have to play Notre Dame out of conference. They could have played somebody weaker like Alabama and Ole Miss did. Ole Miss played Wake Forest, I believe, and Alabama played Wisconsin. If Texas A&M plays Wake Forest or Wisconsin, Texas A&M is right in the thick of this playoff conversation. They only have one loss going into last week. They played Notre Dame to a classic game in week 1. They lost it. Texas A&M fans are going to be screaming that, we didn't have to play that game. We shouldn't be ranked below Alabama and Ole Miss. I'm putting them below because I do think that their meat on the bone is not as strong as Alabama and Ole Miss's, with Alabama and Ole Miss both beating Georgia. But what does that say? That Georgia is a vulnerable football team, and Texas A&M could have been in that club to beat Georgia if they would have pulled them on the schedule. Guess we'll never know. Number 20, UNLV. UNLV is a really good football team. They lost to Syracuse in an all-time classic. That's one of their 2 losses. And they also lost to Boise State in a classic that, because Colorado State lost to Fresno State, they'll have a chance to avenge. And I think they'll have a really good chance to avenge in the Mountain West Championship as long as they take care of business this weekend. Number 21, Tulane. I've already kind of touched on them. They're a really good football team. But I think the thing that's going to hold them back from passing a Big 12 champ is they played a Big 12 team in Kansas State and they lost. They also lost to Oklahoma out of conference, and that's going to matter. I don't think that Tulane can rise much higher than this no matter what they do, and I don't think they should. Number 22, Illinois, and number 23, Kansas State. This tiebreaker, it's hard to kind of split hairs between these 2 teams for me. But I think Illinois, they just have embarrassed themselves a little bit less than Kansas State has down the stretch. Kansas State has had plenty of opportunity to be in the thick of the playoff conversation, and they spoiled it. They did not do it. Number 24, Duke. The reason why I picked Duke at the bottom of these rankings, first off, Missouri has no impressive wins whatsoever, and you could argue Duke has been a little bit more impressive. And when you look at their losses, they're not ugly. They were very competitive despite the score against Miami. They took SMU into overtime, and they lost to a Georgia Tech team who's been nipping everybody in the ACC. They beat Miami as well. So Duke doesn't have a bad loss, and they only have 3 of them. I think that Duke being in the top 25, they're a very valuable team who just keeps finding ways to win. Shout out to Manny Diaz. This last 4 spots, it was between Duke, Colorado. I still think Colorado is a really good team, so I think Colorado belongs here. So Duke, Colorado, and then there was Syracuse and Missouri. Those were the 4 teams I was debating. I'm just not impressed with Missouri. Syracuse has the atrocious loss to Pitt with the pick sixes by Kyle McCord, but Syracuse is going to jump up these rankings if they do end up beating Miami. So we'll see how that all plays out. And, yeah, I already touched on Colorado. The biggest reason they're down here, they lost to Kansas State, and of course, I already talked about Duke. They don't have the embarrassing bad loss that Colorado has out of conference with Nebraska. They got smoked against Nebraska. It was never close. So, I think you got to factor that in. So when you look at the matchups, and this is the final thing I'm going to do in this video, and make sure you guys comment below what you think. Right now, before anything happens with the playoff scenarios here, the buys would be 1 Oregon, 2 Texas, 3 Miami, and then 4 would be Boise State. Then when you get to the other matchups, Ohio State would be the 5 seed. They would be playing number 12, Arizona State. The 6th seed right now would be Penn State, and they will be playing host to Tennessee. Number 7 would be Georgia, and they would be playing host right now to the SMU Mustangs. And number 8 would be Indiana playing host to Notre Dame. And boy, would that be fun to get that in-state matchup between 2 really good teams. That's how I would have it. I know the committee would have it in a different way. But here's the final scenarios that I do want to paint for you. And I'll just go full screen for this little scenario thing. Oh, I don't know what I'm doing here. There's rankings full screen while I figure out what I'm doing. All right, well, we're kind of there. There we go. We got to figure it out here. A little bit choppy. I know this is my first video in a very long time, but I plan on doing this more consistently through the offseason, having more commitment to this, so that way we could have some growth on this channel. But Clemson, what you're going to be looking for with Clemson, it doesn't really matter what happens against South Carolina. They could lose and they still make the playoff. Here's why. If they lose close to South Carolina, that's going to be an impressive win in the South Carolina argument to make the college football playoff, be able to sneak in. But Clemson is going to be, regardless on what happens against South Carolina, they win, they lose, doesn't matter. Maybe if they lose or if they win and they don't end up getting in the conference championship, they can backdoor their way into the college football playoff. But they could get an automatic bid if Miami loses to Syracuse, no matter what happens in that Palmetto showdown or whatever they call it. So Clemson, win or lose against South Carolina, root for Miami to fall to Syracuse. Because if Miami loses to Syracuse, that'll vault Clemson into the conference championship versus SMU, and a winner goes, loser stays type of scenario, though. I do believe that SMU should be in as long as they take care of business this upcoming week, no matter what. Notre Dame, if they lose to USC, I think that knocks them out. Between the bad loss with Northern Illinois and losing your final game of the season, I think the committee is going to punish them and move Notre Dame completely out of the field of 12. We'll see how that plays out, but I think they're going to fall below teams like South Carolina, Alabama, Ole Miss, maybe even Texas A&M if they pull off an upset. But I'm not giving that scenario much love because I do believe that Texas is going to win that game. And then finally, Tennessee could lose and fall out and open up a spot here. And Tennessee might be still involved in that debate, but I think there is a serious shot that Tennessee loses on the road to Vanderbilt. Watch for those chaos scenarios to happen to shake up this playoff race this upcoming Saturday. But for everybody, thank you guys for tuning in. Really appreciate it. Have yourself a happy Thanksgiving. I'm sure I'm going to be online and active. I plan on doing a TikTok live later tonight. Make sure you guys tune in for all of that. But have a happy Thanksgiving if I don't see you again. And enjoy the rest of the college football season and all the chaos to come.